humanitarian crisis, which is what is being experienced by the immigrant communities across the United States. This is a human-created crisis, but nonetheless, it is a crisis that requires our faithful response. So I'm going to give a few remarks now, and then we really want to hear from the very concrete experience of Rodef Sholom in becoming a sanctuary congregation. And then I'll continue with a couple more examples and ways, depending on where you are in your congregation, of how you might take some next steps around this. But I wanted to just set some context. The word sanctuary, of course, comes from the root word sanctus. And those of you who remember your Latin, what does sanctus mean?
Holy.
Holy. So I want to remind us that our understanding, the way that we are going to approach and look at the issue of sanctuary, comes from this root, which is deeply religious and spiritual, which is this word holy. It is the word, sanctuary is the word that we use to refer to where we pray, where the altar is, where we come closest to being in touch with the divine within ourselves and within our community. And we're reminded again and again of the holy within us and the holiness within others. So sanctuary comes from this concept of that which is holy, and recognizing that which is holy in each person, and that which is holy deserves protection, deserves dignity, deserves the right to live, the right to thrive, the right to be fully human. So before there were sanctuary cities or sanctuary schools, there's even such thing now as sanctuary restaurants, different manifestations of the sanctuary movement. Before that, it began really with sanctuary congregations, sanctuary communities. So this term sanctuary is really grounded in the faith traditions and our faith values. It's about the defense and protection of life. It's rooted in the golden rule. Treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated yourself. It's rooted in the Abrahamic tradition's concept of the ger, the resident alien, the person who's in between, who lives among you but is not quite doesn't quite have the status, doesn't quite have the papers, maybe doesn't quite have the citizenship, but they are residents among us, and are dear to God, and that's why they should be dear to us. It is rooted in the mandate to protect human life and dignity, to do no harm. It is rooted in acts of mercy and compassion. It's rooted in understanding that which is holy should be protected, even if it is above and beyond the human law. I want to speak just a little bit about a couple roots of the term sanctuary. I think in the Abrahamic tradition, in the book of Exodus 3, when it talks about, I have witnessed the affliction and suffering of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries. I know well what they are suffering. It's rooted in this understanding that we as faith community have our ear to the ground and have our hearts open to the cries of suffering. And because of that suffering, we are compelled to respond. We act and we react to someone else's suffering. We interiorize their suffering until their suffering becomes part of our suffering. As in the prayer that was read this morning by Dorothy Day, that once we become family, their suffering, of course, is our suffering as well, the suffering of our family. I want to lift up a phrase from the theologian John Sobrino, who was one of the Jesuit priests who escaped assassination in the assassination attempt on the Salvadoran priests at the University of San Salvador. And he talks about this concept of structured mercy. And so I want to use that concept to talk about the principle of sanctuary. A lot of people are get very lost in the detail. Well, what is the details of sanctuary? We're going to talk about that. But first of all, I want us to be rooted in the principle of sanctuary, which is this principle of defense of human life and dignity. And it's also this principle, what he talks about, it's not just acts of compassion and mercy. It's not just a bunch of individual acts, the things you do, but it has to be immersed in the causes of the suffering. We have to look at the root causes. It has to look at the transformation of structures that have created this situation in the first place. Why are there 11.5 million people who have been allowed to live among us as second-class citizens for so long, for 30 years? Why has that been acceptable? Why is there no way for them to become fully members of our community? It calls us to denounce those who victimize. An entire system and structure has been put into place to justify. There's a whole ideology and values that have used to justify why it's okay to accept 11 million undocumented, why it's okay to accept that now they can be hunted down, why 400,000 people were detained last year in immigration detention centers. There are structures that have been put into place before this current president, before the last president. Several presidents ago, this structure has been put into place and has been growing and increasing, where we now have over 200 detention camps. You could call them prisons, jails, detention facilities. We have over 200, including 2 that are especially been built with billions of dollars of our tax money to house women and children seeking asylum. So we have to, having the principle of sanctuary isn't just what we can do locally with a family that may be in crisis or in need. That is really important. But it's also, we have to have this concept of the framework and a principle of sanctuary that means we have to understand how we've gotten into that situation in the first place. How is it that we have so many families that are afraid and are at risk, and why it's so complicated for people to live freely in our society. The structure and principle of sanctuary means we have to denounce those who continue to victimize the millions of jobs that have been created to enforce immigration. We spend more on immigration enforcement than any kind of federal enforcement. More $18 billion goes into federal immigration enforcement. This includes the wall, this includes Border Patrol, this includes Customs and Enforcement at SFO, this includes so many systems and structures geared to keeping people out. We have to lay bare the lies that cover the oppression. Now, there are many lies about immigration that we're hearing. I'm going to just ask you, what are some of the lies that make this okay, that make us live in a state of deniability? What are some of the lies that you hear that are in the airwaves or in the, sometimes they're in our own minds, like troubling us, like, well, what about that? Can you think of any lies that perpetuate?
Immigrants are criminals.
Okay.
Protecting our jobs.
They're rapists.
They just want to use the social services.
Mm-hmm.
Leeches on our system.
There's so many. It's so how easy it is, right, to name 5 right there, right there, and it's not just the far right who wonder about these things, because the lies have been so perpetuated in the discourse. So part of our job, I think, in the principle of sanctuary, we're going to get into the nuts and bolts, but part of our job in the principle of sanctuary as faith leaders is we have to create spaces for a complicated moral discourse around these lies. We have to interrogate these lies. We have to question them. We have to help people think through in an ethical and religious framework, whatever religious framework you come from, what do we think about this? Now, I'm just going to give you, how am I doing on time? Okay. I'm going to give you one example of how we're trying to do this right now. Today, right now, 12 o'clock, there's a group of faith leaders who are leading a prayer service in Governor Brown's office. Uninvited. But they're there and they're gonna, it's a religious filibuster, let's say. They're gonna pray, they're gonna tell stories. So the stories that they are telling right now are to interrogate the narrative of, well, it's okay to deport the criminals. It's okay to deport the felons. There are several ways that people have tried to address this issue. People have tried to say, well, immigrants aren't really criminals. And it's true. You look at statistically, immigrants commit fewer crimes than others. Or people will say, well, not having your tail light, your broken tail light isn't a criminal. Or if you were deported and you recrossed the border, that shouldn't be considered criminal. But what we're trying to do is actually say, well, let's actually talk about real crime. Let's talk about people who have actually committed a real felony. Do we believe that they should be deported, that they don't have due process? Do we believe that they don't have a right to re-enter? So we're telling the story, for example, of my friend Key, who I met in San Quentin. I was passing San Quentin today, just now, so I was thinking about him. He spent 20 years in San Quentin for committing a murder that he committed when he was 16 years old. He was a refugee. He never became a citizen. His family didn't understand that as a refugee, it's not automatic. You have to go through a whole process. You have to pay money, etc. He had never become a citizen. So when he gotten involved in a Cambodian street gang in Richmond, because many refugees were dropped into communities that were some of the poorest, least serviced communities, he said he didn't even really know how to read English until he got to prison. Now tell me something about that. If you come to this country and you go to school for 8 years or 10 years and you've never really learned, whose fault is that? That he turns to the gangs, as a way to find community and belonging. So he committed a murder. He spent 20 years in San Quentin. Liza Klein, some of you know her, she used to be the pastor at First United Methodist Church in San Rafael. She taught classes with Key within San Quentin. And so that when he got to his parole board, the parents of the victim said, Key, we advocate for your release because we know you are not that same person when you were 16 years old. We know that you are a reformed individual. We know that you deserve a second chance to contribute to your community, to help other young kids not go the path that you went. So they're telling the story of Key because what's happened to Key is that instead of all the wonderful reentry programs that many of us have been advocating for, to bring people home, to give people second chances, because he's not a citizen, there's a double standard. Because he's not a citizen, the day he got released on parole from San Quentin, he was immediately turned over to immigration detention, where he spent many more months in worse conditions than San Quentin. Immigration detention was worse conditions than San Quentin. So we're actually trying to have, as an example of this principle of sanctuary, is, well, let's actually, who are we saying is expendable? Who is our society saying is expendable? And let's actually interrogate that ethically. Should he be deported? Or should he doesn't even have any family where he's going to be deported to. His whole family is here in Richmond and San Francisco. Should he be given a second chance? So the principle of sanctuary, I want to say today for us means 3 R's. I just made this up, so I hope this makes sense. The 3 R's. Instead of reading, writing, and arithmetic, which we all know is spelled wrong, starts with an A, is the first one is right. The principle of sanctuary means asking, what is it right to do? What is it right to do in this moment? The second thing is relationship. We have to be grounded in the relationship with communities and families and individuals who are most affected, whose lives are at risk, whose families are at risk, whose future is like in turmoil right now. We have to come into proximity. If we're not in proximity in our congregations, we have to figure out how do we get into proximity and relationship. And that relationship, one model I like to use is like the story of Naomi and Ruth. In the Hebrew scriptures, we will walk with you. Your God will be my God. We will walk with you and your family in what unfolds. Because so much of what's ahead for the immigrant community. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if DACA is going to get canceled this week by President Trump, but it could. The third R is risk. And a sanctuary is not, and being faithful, nobody guaranteed that being faithful, true to your faith, was going to be without risk. And now more than ever, there are certain communities really being put at risk. So that proximity and that relationship will empower us to be willing to take more risk and to share the risk. We're in a situation where nobody can ever promise you that nothing bad will ever come to you because of a stand that you take, because of something you do. But isn't that what faith is about? Isn't that what faith should be about? So I'll stop there with those 3 R's. And what were they again? Right? What is right? Relationship and risk. So I'm going to ask Rabbi Elana.
Again, a big thank you to the Marin Interfaith Council for convening this important gathering, and to Reverend Deborah Lee, who's been doing this work for so many decades now, again, not as just a result of this administration. So I've learned so much from her just in my brief time knowing her, and it just fills me with a lot of strength and gratitude that we have so many teachers to turn to if we're new to this work, as I was new to this work just in January, this sanctuary-specific conversation, and there are so many people who've walked this path. So for us not to let the fact that we're new to this, if we are, be a deterrent in any way from getting involved. So I'm gonna pass this out. If anyone could help me, there are 30 copies, so if you could share one for every two people, and Scott's gonna help. So Reverend Deborah set me up really well so that I can go into the nuts and bolts completely. So I'm not gonna talk about our moral imperative or the texts from our traditions. I feel like you covered that so well, Deborah. And my task today is really to share with you what happened at Rodef Sholom when we started having this conversation. How did we go about becoming a sanctuary synagogue? What lessons might I be able to share with you from our community? So I'd like to start with that, and also to say that I am really looking forward. Please use me as a resource, because as a part of this work, I've reached out to so many other congregations, and that my one thing I think our goal is what does a network really look like? And I think something that Marin County and the whole Bay Area and the nation has been trying to do in this moment is figure out how are our networks working together and in communication with one another? How are we building this together and not in our own silos? So I'm very committed to that conversation, and so glad we're here today. So January. Let's go back to January and the inauguration, and right after the election, really, our congregation, who has been involved in many different aspects of social justice work for many years, asked ourselves again, okay, this is a particular moment where our community at Rodef Sholom is suffering and wants to know and understand how we can show up in this world that many of us felt was new when we woke up on November 9th, but in many ways, as Reverend Deborah shared, is not so new for the people who have been impacted. But I know my community was suffering, so we called a large meeting right after the Muslim ban was issued. We called a large meeting of our congregation to listen. It was a house meeting of sorts. To hear what did our community need in this moment, how did they want to act. So about 150 people showed up, and we just listened. In the back of our mind was becoming a sanctuary congregation. That was kind of what the clergy were holding as one potential response to this moment. But we first wanted to hear from our community so we could build consensus and build this conversation with them together. So what did we hear from this conversation and the listening? We heard, you might be familiar with this, why are you listening to us? We want to act. Tell us what to do. They were mad. They were very mad at us. And I was not deterred because I knew that we could come back and say, well, we listened first. So, of course, as we all know, as clergy, that part is very important. We held a second meeting. Same number of people showed up, many of the people who came to the first meeting, and we said, you've asked us, you've said, tell us what to do, tell us how to act. We've come up with four tasks that we're going to break up into, and one of those groups was becoming a sanctuary congregation. So we just gave them what they'd asked for. Tell us what to do. So we came up with that task. It didn't come to us. In this small group of about 20 people, one of the first things I presented was sanctuary is a term that's defined so many different ways by so many different communities. And each congregation needs to come up with its own definition of sanctuary. I brought these resources that you see here, which is just one of so many resources out there for how to become a sanctuary congregation. This is in the Jewish world. There are many non-Jewish resources, of course. What I liked about this was turn to page 2. It says, sanctuary takes many forms, 7 levels of response. And I knew, because I'd spoken with our executive director and with some people on the board, there was some behind the scenes conversations, that we would not be able to provide physical shelter at our congregation just yet. We don't have showers there. There are a lot of things around that that we didn't want to touch right away because we wanted to push this forward through our board very quickly. We knew our values were behind it. We, especially as a Jewish community, but I think everyone can fall back on this narrative that we are a community of immigrants. We have been told to stay away from these shores, and we've paid the price. So it was a bipartisan conversation. We can fall back on that narrative that this is a part of our Jewish values. And I think everyone here can too. So we knew we wanted that the moral imperative was there, that we could rely on that to push this forward very quickly, but potentially not if we were going to be offering physical shelter. So we wanted to make it clear really quickly that shelter is only one aspect of sanctuary, that is not the whole story, and that there are many ways that we could declare sanctuary and function as a sanctuary community, show up for our values through advocacy, through accompaniment work, through working to build a network to be a part of the rapid response network that's happening in Marin, all sorts of ways that we could show up. What I want to say, that meeting was probably one of the harder ones I've had ever in my life as clergy. Why? I wasn't expecting it at all. Not at all. I thought I was giving people what they had asked for. Tell us how to show up, and then we'll do it. I brought to them, I said, let's research, which was a scary term for them. I said, let's continue to build our relationships. They were very upset that they didn't feel, again, that we were acting immediately. And that was such an important moment for me to remember that in all of these justice spaces and conversations we're having, they're really pastoral moments for us. And that what was happening was my congregants are in so much pain about what is going on in the world right now, and so angry and so upset and needed to feel that sense of contribution to the world and feeling like they could do something to control or change what's happening. They could help in some way. And I had missed that a little bit, that I didn't create the container for that frustration. It was a very tough meeting. Somebody left the room crying, and people were really struggling and didn't understand why research was needed, why they couldn't just jump to action. But I do want to say that we came out of that moment even stronger, and we have a sanctuary team of about 20 people who've really been doing that work since that meeting in March, and it's a really strong team on our synagogue, and there's so many directions it's going. So I'll tell you what happened after that meeting was people understood that they did need to research first, and that relationship was the most important part of how to start in this work. And we have a deep relationship with the Venetia Valley School across the street, which we began about 4 years ago. And as soon as we started having these conversations about sanctuary and what that would look like for our community, the team reached out to Venetia Valley Family Center and said, we're in a new phase of our partnership where we'd like to talk about sanctuary. We're talking about declaring sanctuary at Rodef Sholom. Can we talk together about what sanctuary would look like and what your community's needs are? I want to say that that community, which is predominantly Latino, many undocumented immigrants in that community, but they've also provided sanctuary for us when there was the bomb threats to the JCC. We were able to evacuate to their community. So this is really, when I think about sanctuary, I also, especially in our world today, just think about how we are all sanctuaries for one another. And I think that that's been a real part of this conversation, even though we're focusing mostly on the immigrant community, but we have both needed from one another. So we started this conversation together. We took a lot of they were hosting some Know Your Rights trainings. Our team went to all of those and really took advantage of everything that's happening in Marin with Canal Alliance, really took advantage of the resources here. And quickly, I'm seeing that I have a few more minutes. So we built our definition with them. And then we decided, if you look to, I didn't number the pages, but to the back it says resolution of the board of directors. And then the next page, so that was all we gave to the board. It was almost nothing. So originally people were saying, we need to find out from the lawyers, like what are the risks, what are the this, what are the that. And we said, leave that to the executive director to talk with the lawyers to see what the risks are. But our role as a lay team is really just to figure out what our definition is to bring to the board so that the board doesn't even have to worry about that. And this was a very smooth part of our process. Because there were the behind the scenes, we set the board up already for success, for that meeting to go very successfully. The executive director was fully committed to this and had the conversations that were necessary to ease people's mind. And then we brought this is actually from a synagogue in Oakland whose process got stuck in the board because they were worried about the details. Our process did not, because I think there were good channels for communication behind the scenes, and we brought this to the board and they said, we don't even think this goes far enough. It was a unanimous vote to declare sanctuary, and I think largely because we said if it would ever come to sheltering a family, we'll have that conversation down the road. But we want to show up for the immigrant community in Marin, and these are the different ways we're going to do it. So if you turn the page, that document, which I won't go through, is once the board declared sanctuary and passed unanimously, this was the document we sent out to the community announcing that we were a sanctuary congregation. So it details a little bit of the moral imperative, a little bit about what our definition as Rodef Sholom meant. You'll see that right up at the top we put, this does not mean physical shelter for us, just again to make sure that people didn't get stuck in that part of the conversation. And just, so you can peruse that and ask me any questions about that. But just really quickly, so after we declared, what did this mean? Well, very soon after we declared, and it doesn't matter whether declared or not, we would have done the same thing. But because I really think so many communities are operating as sanctuaries without formally declaring it. So that's a whole question about being public versus being private. But I think it did help in terms of people, our values being shown in the community, and then people reaching out to us because of that. But very quickly, a father was arrested. I think many of you know his name. Hugo Mejia was arrested at the beginning of May. He's a father at Venetia Valley. And because of these conversations that we've been having with Venetia Valley starting in February, we were maybe the second or third call they made. And immediately we worked in partnership from the very beginning with that community, and the sanctuary team showed up driving Hugo's wife to lawyers' appointments. I mean, anything that the family needed, our team of congregants was there, and we were there. We had that huge rally that many of you were at, and of course the first thing I said was, well, don't you want to host it at Venetia Valley? It's your community, again, not wanting to be fall into the white savior model. And I said it, and they said, we don't want it at our community because our community, and I didn't understand quite their reason, but they said our community would feel safer. And again, probably because people were worried about who would show up at Venetia Valley and who might feel threatened. But they said our community would feel safer if you hosted this rally on Hugo's behalf at Rodef Sholom. So we've had these very intentional conversations throughout, and have been involved in advocating for Hugo's family specifically for the last 4 months. But our congregation is also looking at many different ways to expand our work in this area. And through this work, we've gotten connected with so many synagogues and churches throughout the Bay that have been involved in this work, and just in a process now of figuring, well, what does this work look like moving together as congregations in the Bay Area working together on this work. There are so many cases, of course, out there, and how are we sharing this load and showing up for our community? And so I know, Marin Interfaith Council immediately brought all of our communities together when Hugo Mejia was arrested. So I know that there's so much potential for continued dialogue here in Marin of how we show up for this work. So I know that's just a beginning, and I'm happy to be a resource on the nuts and bolts, but sanctuary looks different for every community, and each community has their own process. So Reverend Deborah is going to talk a little bit more about some other models of sanctuary in other congregations.
Such a beautiful example, and so helpful to kind of hear the step-by-step, process that you went through. Could someone help pass around? There's a handout on the back that talks about the 4 ways of sanctuary, towards the right side. What I want to do is just kind of give you an overview, kind of building off of Rodef Shalom's experience, give you kind of a broader view of sanctuary, because as Rabbi Elana has shared, different congregations have defined and expressed it in different ways. And I have a friend, Jose Artiga, who's part of the 1980 sanctuary movement, and he said there are 1,000 ways to practice sanctuary. So do not be limited. The sanctuary movement has grown on the national level. Before the election, there were 350 sanctuary congregations. Since the election, there are now over 800. So it just catapulted. There has been a slowdown, and part of that slowdown of the congregations becoming sanctuary has been because there has been a coordinated attack on the word sanctuary. since post-election, there's been an attack to make sanctuary into a bad word. And I think for us as faith communities, we have to maintain strongly that the understanding of this concept and our commitment to the concept, and understand that it is being attacked because it is actually a threat. That's one of the reasons why that has met that response. But I noticed that some congregations have kind of slowed down and gotten, because they've been susceptible to what part of what's happened around the word sanctuary. And happy to clarify more about that later. So in the Bay Area, in Northern California, our organization, the Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity, we work with congregations here as well as in the inland valleys, Riverside, San Bernardino County, with congregations who want to be engaged in the issues of immigrant justice and also around mass incarceration. But in the Bay Area, where I've been mostly up here, has been, we also have seen the increase of sanctuary congregations from about 5 before the election to 27 who have gone through a process. And I don't even think I've counted Rodef Sholom in that. So the other thing is that we're also trying to make sure we can identify other congregations and that we know who we can reach out to. Because there are times when some of us I just got a call today from Santa Cruz, a woman who's facing deportation in Santa Cruz, and wondering, is there some way that congregations can support and help? So I want to be able to reach out to who in Santa Cruz can I call, who in Modesto can I call, who in Novato can I call, and so I think the more we can be coordinated, the better. One of the changes since the inauguration is that the speed in which people are getting deported has increased rapidly. Many are sometimes getting deported without even seeing a judge. And so our ability to be able to respond quickly, has become more imperative. So there's 4 main ways that I have categorized ways that in the Bay Area people are practicing sanctuary. And I have put them in order of importance. And this could change, but part of sanctuary is contextual. If we were a group of faith leaders in Tucson, Arizona, the kind of actions that we may think sanctuary needs to look like would be very different. But we're here in the Bay Area, which I want to just point out a couple particularities that I think we want to know about in terms of how we respond to sanctuary. One thing is that we are a destination on the migrant trail. I have a colleague in Tucson who has been able to house someone for 3 days for me, but she said they cannot stay in our church more than 3 days because it is too dangerous. So we had to quickly actually get someone from here to drive down and pick up the person because their family was here in the Bay Area. So we in the Bay Area are part of the migrant trail. We are a destination point. We are considered a safe haven. One, because there are people have family members who've come before in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So of course, when you're going to flee somewhere, you're going to go where you have an address. You know somebody. Or you may know that someone speaks your language. You heard there was somebody, a shopkeeper, a pastor, a congregation that they could, that someone you could go to for help. People have heard that it's true, there are resources here, especially legal resources. Immigrants are not automatically given a public defender when they're detained, unlike the criminal justice system, even though they are in jail. So they have to be able to go out and get an attorney who specializes in immigration law, which is a very difficult, one of the most complex areas of law besides taxes. So there are here in the Bay Area legal resources, pro bono, low bono, and just more of them. So that's one thing to be aware of. Even though our cost of living is outrageous here, people are still going to come here. We are already seeing people coming from Texas to California, this internal migration because of the crisis that's been created. So I think that's one thing. The other thing about the Bay Area is that we have progressive lawmakers. And so people know that we have been able to enact laws, whether it's police departments or city councils or county resources, they know that they can send their kids to school and it's not going to be an issue. They know that their utilities, they're going to be able to get, utility hookup even if they don't have a social security. Some parts of the country, you cannot get water and electricity if you don't have a social security number. So they know that we have done the work in the last 20 years in California to create a society and a state that has said the issue of your just like the issue of your skin color should not be an issue, we have said the issue of where you were born should not be an issue. You're a resident of our community, and how do we make sure that your kids can thrive? How do we make sure that we, contribute and that has something to do with why California is the 7th largest economy in the world. I believe that. So, 4 ways. Let me get going. Sorry. The first thing is advocacy, and this goes back to the 1980s sanctuary movement. They were not just trying to create safe spaces within their congregations, but they said, we will continue to do this until the whole world is a sanctuary. And this is important because nobody wants to live the next 3 years of the Trump administration or longer inside a congregation. That is just like a nicer form of house arrest. People want to be able to go to work. They want to be able to feed their kids. They want to be able to contribute. They want to be able to go to the library and not be afraid. But so how do we create laws? Thank you. So advocacy is how do we create laws that make sure that people are safe and are protected? Then the number one way that people are getting turned over to ICE right now is through transfers from the jail. And there was just a call on the hotline in Alameda County. There was a domestic dispute. The Hayward police was called. The mother, in this case, she was the aggressor or having the issues, was detained. The charges were dropped. And then, lo and behold, she got turned over to ICE. So the issue of advocacy right now is to make sure that our law enforcement are not notifying ICE and becoming a throughway for people to end up into the immigration system. I just was in Boston, all that history, American history. There was a picture of an old bill, the wall bills they have, and it was about police. And it was saying, notice to the African American community of Boston, and saying, don't talk to the police, because the police is working to enforce the fugitive slave law, and they're working to return people to their slave owners. So it was like, don't talk to police. I thought, God, that's the same thing we're dealing with right now. Can we trust law enforcement to do their job, which is really, responding to issues of public safety here, but not in doing the work of immigration? The second thing is accompaniment, and that is like the accompaniment that Rodef Sholom has done with Ugo's family. It's also been accompaniment to new arriving families and youth. Many are arriving seeking asylum, but without family members or support or a team that can help them access their right to due process, to help them go through that process of trying to find an attorney, which is very difficult, to walk with them through that journey, to go to court with them, to help them try to stabilize, get their kids enrolled in school. All that kind of accompaniment is another way of ways that congregations are doing sanctuary. We have about 13 teams in the East Bay of congregations who are walking with a newly arrived immigrant family or a family in immigration crisis. The third way is networks of protection, and that is making sure that, like you said, your community knows that you guys are sanctuary, so that when people need protection, they have a place to go. They have a place to reach out to. You may not be able to resolve everything, but at least they know where they can make a call, and you guys will get some things into place. It means making sure that we have policies and procedures in place. Should I show up to a congregation, to a hospital, to a school, do our employees of those places know what to do to make sure that we are protecting everyone who's part of our communities? The fourth thing is housing hospitality. And this is a special request and a special expression of sanctuary that I'm offering to the faith communities, because many of us own property. Either our members own property or our congregations own property. That one of the reasons why the scriptures speak out around God's special love and intention for the migrant is that the migrant has nothing. The migrant has nothing usually but the clothes on their back. They don't own land. What they have is their labor. And maybe they have a family. In this case, we have migrants coming in. Maybe they have a family member, but those family members are typically also renters. And even though the family members have tried to welcome people in, the landlord will say, you can't have 3 more people here. Even though they would, the family members would like to host. So one of the special requests that we have noticed, one of the gaps in services for migrants is that there are not enough places, on the market for refugees and immigrants to rent at below market rate. And they cannot qualify for affordable housing programs, being new and not having a social security, even if they are in an asylum process. So that's one of the issues that we have been putting out to congregations. We're putting out a congregational migrant housing survey. So there's a congregation in Alameda, which has converted their parsonage, which was used for education, to house a family. They've actually housed them for 1 year. They're extending it to 2 years. A family of 5. It was really impossible for them to find housing. We have a congregation in Berkeley who has converted an office space for 3-week stays for people getting released from detention in Richmond. And if they have no family, they're just going to be out in the parking lot of the detention center. So they said, no, we want to create a hospitable place that treats them with dignity and just help them figure out their next step in the next 3 weeks. And we do have some congregations who've offered sanctuary in the case of a final order of deportation. We have a few. We haven't needed them up to this point. But so that's why I'm calling it housing hospitality. It's also the issue of respite hospitality. If there were an emergency, if ICE were to conduct a raid in the Canal District and people were afraid to go home, would your congregation be prepared to let people stay for a few nights? So it's partly we have to get this emergency preparedness mentality. What are we prepared to do? And I want to just echo what Elana says, that you don't have to figure it all out to become sanctuary. You can say, we can do one thing. We can take the first step. This is what sanctuary means to us now. And we will have, with our sanctuary team, discern these other things and needs as they emerge and figure things out that are going to take longer term. So I'm going to just pause there. Just wanted to lay out kind of what the different options look like and expressions. At this point, we would like to invite you to turn to find a partner at your table, to turn to a neighbor and just, bounce off and buzz with them about kind of what's coming up for you, what stands out for you as it relates to your own work and your own congregation. And as you are in conversation with them, there are some postcards, or no, it's not very postcards. Note cards on the table. And we invite you to write down any questions that you may have that you'd like Elana and I to answer in our time of Q&A, which will, so you'll have about 10 minutes of discussion with your neighbors or your table. Okay?